You might or might not be surprised that every one of the top 500 supercomputers in the world runs on an operating system called Linux. Not Windows, not Mac, Linux. This biannual top 500 list tracks the fastest supercomputers on Earth, and for years, no supercomputer has used Windows or Mac. They all run on Linux. This is the El Capitan, the fastest computer on Earth. It is a $600 million supercomputer, and it handles classified tasks relating to the US's stockpile of nuclear weapons. It runs on Linux. Frontier, another US supercomputer and also one of the fastest computers on Earth, this computer is used to build cutting-edge models of everything, from subatomic particles to entire galaxies. What does it run on? You guessed it, Linux. All of these supercomputers, the most powerful machines that humanity has ever built, they all run on Linux. But it's not just supercomputers. Even the backbone of the internet and cloud services rely on Linux. I'm talking about major cloud providers, AWS, Google, Microsoft Azure, all run on Linux. Linux is also huge in enterprise. 90% of IBM's mainframe customers, well, they use Linux. If you have an Android smartphone, Android uses Linux. In short, Linux is everywhere behind the scenes. Yet, when you go to buy a new PC or laptop today, the shelf is dominated by Windows or Mac. You will rarely see a machine shipping Linux out the box. So how is it possible that Linux can run the world's supercomputers, but somehow isn't the default in your everyday laptop? What's the catch? To understand the mystery of Linux, we need to travel back to the beginning. Before Linux, in the 1960s, 1970s, computers were basically split into two universes. Universe 1 was big, serious computing. This included universities, labs, companies, running expensive machines. These environments ran on something called Unix. Unix was built at Bell Labs around 1969, and it was designed for the kinds of computers that had to be shared by lots of people at once. Think universities, labs, big research companies. Unix worked in this universe because it was multi-user, multitasking by design. Lots of people could use the same machine and run different programs at the same time. It was also stable, predictable, and quite portable. So Universe 1, big serious computing, and Unix was the environment. Universe 2 was a brand new world of personal computers, the machines that people bought for home and even their small businesses. And those personal computers ran on something completely different. At that time, personal computers, or PCs, were created by IBM. Microsoft was around, and they had an environment called MS-DOS. At the time, Microsoft cuts a deal where MS-DOS is the default operating system in quite a few hardware. MS-DOS becomes a default, and defaults are powerful. Most of MS-DOS is command line, so it's not very pretty and not very user-friendly. But it is what is shipped, so it becomes the normal. Then Apple comes along and basically says, what if computers were built for humans? So Apple's Macintosh becomes popular because of its graphical user interface, or GUI. This is the idea that you click on icons and menus instead of typing commands. And this was the beginning of computer as an appliance era. Because of Apple, Microsoft responds with Windows. At first, Windows was just a layer over MS-DOS, but eventually it did become its own thing. So by the late 80s, 90s, the world actually looked like this. You had Unix, which lived in computers, labs, and major corporations, and it was powerful, customizable, but not very user-friendly. You then had MS-DOS, or Windows, or even Macintosh. And this dominates the everyday personal computer world because of its ease of availability, user-friendliness, but also it's not that customizable. You just get what you get. And into this world walks a student from Helsinki, 21-year-old Linus Torvalds, who's using a PC that runs on MS-DOS, but he prefers the Unix system that he has used before at university. He has this thought: I want Unix power on my cheap PC. So he decides to build something Unix-like that he can run on normal personal computers. So Linus started a small project to write a simple free kernel. A kernel is the core of an operating system, and he writes his kernel for personal computers, mainly for IBM machines. His first public post was to a news group, and it famously said, "I'm doing a free operating system. Just a hobby, won't be big and professional like GNU." GNU was another project to build an operating system that is Unix-like. So not only does Linus build the operating system, he also decides to share it. In 1991, he posted an online alert to other PC users. He made the software available as a free download, and he released the source code so others could modify it. And by 1994, Linux kernel version 1.0 was released. This is the part where Linux started taking over, and the reason is quite interesting. So back in 1983, Richard Stallman introduced something called the GNU project. The mission here was to build a free Unix-compatible operating system. Stallman wanted software where users could run, study it, modify it, and share it. So GNU wasn't just one program. It was a collection of essential building blocks that you need to run a computer. GNU had a compiler, command line tools, shells, and libraries. But GNU had a problem. It still needed one part you cannot skip: a kernel. And a kernel is the core of the operating system, the part that sits between the software and the physical machine. And that's where Linux comes in. Linux is the kernel. GNU had everything but the kernel. So when Linux finally appeared, it solved the problem. So Stallman and others built the utilities of the GNU, and those utilities were added to the Linux kernel. This created a complete system, often called GNU Linux. And once that was created, it goes boom. It spreads. So once GNU Linux came about, the growth was explosive. Linux was quickly ported to many hardware platforms. By the late 1990s, Linux had evolved from being a basement hobby to the biggest threat to proprietary Unix and even Microsoft's own server business. And remember, Linus Torvalds releases it in the most suspiciously generous way. Free download, open source code, and an open invitation for other programmers to improve it. Now, this is happening in the 1990s. During this time, the modern internet also goes boom. It turns into a global infrastructure. Suddenly, companies and universities need machines that can run 24/7, handle multiple users, speak the language of different networks, and be customized for weird hardware and weird workloads. And Linux was basically built for that. So throughout the 90s, Linux grows continuously and actually ends up running most of the servers on the internet. And because of this, Linux actually ended the reign of the traditional Unix system in corporate data centers, and Linux became a major force in enterprise IT. Companies like IBM and HP started even contributing code to Linux and sponsoring Linux development. And fast forward to now, Linux, while popular, still has a very specific reputation. If the computer is expensive and critical, there's a good chance that it runs on Linux. Why? So for supercomputers, Linux becomes a default. And when you zoom in on specific machines, you'll understand why. For example, Red Hat has publicly announced that El Capitan's OS platform is Red Hat Enterprise Linux. They emphasize the need of testing, assurance, and mission-critical reliability in supercomputing, so they had to choose Linux. Supercomputers don't want an OS that is nice. They want an OS where they can strip out what they don't need, optimize any scheduling and networking, tune performance if they have any custom hardware, and just control every layer of the stack. And Linux is basically the only mainstream operating system that has that level of control and has the ecosystem maturity to allow it. And when it comes to the web and cloud, well, Linux is the engine room. So W3Techs, which creates and deploys web technology surveys, they tracked different operating systems used by websites. Their February 2026 stats shows that Linux is used by 60.8% of websites. Windows is a much smaller share. And on top of that, cloud follows naturally. Major cloud providers offer Linux because Linux is just what most server software expects. And also, if there's one place where you cannot tolerate any junk software, it's in orbit. Looking at a very widely reported example, the International Space Station laptops were migrated from Windows XP to Linux. And the reasoning given publicly was essentially stability, reliability, and control. So Linux conquered all of these complicated and complex places where performance, reliability, and control is the most important. So if Linux is the go-to operating system for computers that can't fail, why isn't it the operating system that people choose for normal, everyday personal computers? So Linux runs high-end computing, but mainstream users almost never choose it. Why? First, let's look at the numbers. Even in one of the most tech-heavy markets like the United States, Linux barely cracks 5% of desktop share. A survey found that Windows holds about 65% of US desktops, and Apple's Mac OS sits around 24%. Linux only reached about 5% in the US. And globally, its share is much smaller, around 2 to 4%. In other words, Windows and Mac roughly dominate around 85 to 90% of desktops. Why? Why isn't Linux the default on your desktop? Now, you're probably saying, yes, everyone knows that Linux isn't the default OS because it isn't user-friendly, it's just full of raw functionality, whereas Windows is built with normal, everyday users in mind. That's why Windows won the desktop. But that's not true. Linux didn't lose a desktop because it couldn't compete with a user-friendly Windows. There could have easily been a user-friendly layer built on top of Linux. Linux lost a desktop because it was never a fair fight. Microsoft didn't just win users, it won factories. Now remember, when Linux started to get popular, Microsoft was a fully fledged beast at the time. So if you want to understand why Microsoft became the default operating systems on PCs, even when Linux was around, you have to stop imagining millions of people choosing Windows, because that never happened. They bought a computer and Windows was already there, and Microsoft worked extremely hard to keep it that way. In the early personal computer era, Microsoft used licensing structures that made it painful for manufacturers to ship anything else other than Windows. An example of this was something called the per-processor licensing. So at the time Windows was popular, it launched before Linux, it was user-friendly, and Windows was what most customers would expect when they were buying personal computers. And because of that, Microsoft had huge leverage. PC manufacturers started to need Windows in order to sell PCs. Because of this, Microsoft arranged a contract called a per-processor licensing. And Microsoft basically said to the PC makers, look, for every PC that you ship that could run Windows, you pay Microsoft X amount of dollars, whether or not Windows is actually installed, because you need us to sell your PCs. And because PC manufacturers had no choice but to accept it, they signed that contract. Then if the PC manufacturer decides to sell a PC without Windows installed but another operating system, they still had to pay Microsoft that per-processor fee, and then on top of that, pay the other OS vendor as well. They would get double billed. So if you were a PC manufacturer in that era, the decision wouldn't have been which OS is nice. It would have been which operating system lets us ship the most units and cost the least. And that answer is Windows. And that's how the Windows default was created. It was just everywhere at the point of sale. And if you control the PC manufacturers, you control what people boot up on day one. And unfortunately, at that time, Linux just didn't have any single company paying PC manufacturers to have Linux shipped. Linux at the time couldn't guarantee a uniform customer experience on millions of the machines. Microsoft could. So I really think if Linux started exploding just before Windows could get created, it would be different and may have been the default operating system. But unfortunately, it was a little too late. Linux is incredible at being customizable, efficient, reliable. But desktops were won by the boring things. What comes pre-installed? And unfortunately, Microsoft was there first. Then, once a specific operating system becomes a default, it's now, well, what does your job use? What do the repair shops support? What runs your exact apps without any drama? And that's why Linux dominates in a place where engineers want complexity and control. But it probably struggled when people wanted the opposite, like certainty and simplicity. And at this point, Microsoft and Apple have decades of momentum. They are the defaults. Now they have their own app ecosystems, customer support, and marketing. They are, and always have been, really hard to dislodge on every single desktop. However, Linux is still the best operating system in the world. It just runs the world from backstage. Thank you for watching. If you like my content, please like, comment, and subscribe. I will see you on the next one.